Perfect. Thanks a lot, Leon. And hello, everyone. I'm absolutely delighted to be here today and kicking off what is a pretty impressive lineup of speakers that we have today. So credit to Leon and Chris and everyone at Ukie for pulling this together. Let me just quickly share my screen now, which hopefully you can all see. So real shame that we can't actually physically be in person together today. Hopefully next time we'll be able to do that. That said, we've got a pretty good setup in terms of both with Zoom and what we've got over lunchtime. What we do want to do is make this talk as interactive as possible. So please do put any questions you may have in the chat function. My wife will attest to this. My ability to multitask is pretty much zero. So I won't be able to respond to those as we go, but Leon's very kindly offered to keep track of the questions as they go through, and we should have at least 5 minutes at the end to pick up on a few questions. Also, what would be really great, so we can actually tailor the day for the content that will be relevant to you. I've just got a few questions would be great if actually you could just respond to. So just three things around just understanding a bit about your role, about the studio that you work for, and sort of the challenge you're facing. Actually, what I want to use is something called Slido, if you haven't used it before. So if you just go to a browser, slido.com, and enter, you'll see an option to enter a code, which is C992. You should see these questions up here. And again, just three questions would be really great to get your response on. So as soon as you see the option that fits for you, if you can just choose that and click submit. So in terms of the first one, so how do you best describe your role? Excellent, they're starting to come through now, but is it a founder director? Do you work in operations? And again, I'll class that as anything which is kind of non-dev, so it can be finance or anything else. Great, the categories are moving around a bit. The I do everything category, which I personally relate to a lot, particularly when you're in a smaller business, it can feel like that covers everything. We've also then got perhaps some more sort of traditional roles, whether that's producer, artist, engineer, designer, and I do stuff. None of these is kind of a smaller category. Great. I think that's that's coming through pretty clearly. So that's very helpful. The I do everything and founder kind of right up there. So thank you for that. What I will do, I sort of and appreciate not everyone's responded to that yet, but I think that gives quite a clear view of things. If we just jump onto the next question as well. So just understand a bit about the size of the company you work for. So kind of 0 to 5, 11 to 20. Working your way up, and so kind of the highest category we've got is at 100 plus. So again, that's starting to come through. Interesting, we've got a few 100 plus in there as well, but an awful lot sort of, I guess, at that sort of earlier stage, which is great. We've got some really good examples covering things from that early stages, and it is such an exciting time to be part of that. Again, I'll just give it sort of 10 seconds more to just sort of see where that comes through. But yeah, I think that's sort of quite a clear weighting in terms of where things are at, which is fantastic. Great, okay, and then just last question, just trying to understand a bit more about what you want to get out of today and sort of running through those options. So it might be that you're sort of a bit further on that journey and you specifically know that you want to raise finance, that first option there, and you kind of, you're at a point where you need to do something. However, looking at we've got quite a few people perhaps in the 0 to 5 studios, sort of that more sort of, that top answers coming through. That's great. That I run a studio and generally interested to learn more. So again, we'll just give that a bit more time to come through. And some people have chosen, I've made a massive mistake. This is about finance. I'm out of here. I was hoping that wasn't going to be the case, but fair enough. If you want to leave, you can do. I prefer that than heckling, but no, that's fine. Great. Okay, so that's really interesting as well. So we've got kind of I guess a broad cross section of people that are just generally interested to learn more, and then obviously perhaps a bit further along and that actually want to understand about split raising finance. So actually that works out really well. It's probably worth just giving a quick introduction about myself. So I always dreamt of being probably similar to you guys, but I dreamt of being an entrepreneur. Sadly, at the age of 21, I made a decision to almost go probably the most extreme opposite of that. And I became an accountant, sadly. But however, what I've done in my career since then has pretty much predominantly worked with fast-growing entrepreneurial businesses. And so for half of my career, I was working for a large accounting firm, a good chunk of that in corporate finance, where I was working to facilitate people much like yourself obtaining normally their first round of financing, or it might be with private equity funding. And I really enjoyed that. However, sort of being on the outside as an advisor wasn't the same as being part of it. So the sort of second half of my career, I've worked in businesses on sort of very exciting growth trajectories. The last place was that. It's actually 20 people, so very much relates to that I do everything role, which I was doing then, but we had a clear remit that I was brought in to help us grow. We got to about 100 people in 3 years before selling the company. And then I joined Tonic Games when we're about 200 people, which is probably worth giving just a bit of details about Tonic Games. So it's actually our birthday next week. We will have, it will turn 15 years old. This may be how we'll be celebrating in a socially responsible way. Hopefully not. And just some other facts about us. And so, we kind of have 3 main businesses in the group. So Mediatonic's been the longest standing. I'll touch upon the other companies, Regular Corp and Fortitude, a little bit later on. What we may well be best known for, given the last month we've had, is this game called Fall Guys that launched in August, and we've just been absolutely blown away by the success of this. It's kind of far exceeded our expectations, and it kind of puts us as a business in a really interesting place. And actually kind of, I guess the point of what I want to talk about today is not necessarily the game Fall Guys, but actually there's a whole series of decisions we've made over the last 15 years that have managed to get to us to a point with Fall Guys. So what I'm going to rather ambitiously do is try to squeeze in 15 years of learning in 15 minutes. We'll see if that's feasible. And I guess sort of one of the key points, which I'm really passionate about, but also Tonic Games, one of our values is actually creating studios to stand the test of time. And that's not just our own studio, that's actually, we want to help others in the industry. We've got something we'll be launching relatively soon called Tonic University, but it's all about sharing these learnings and content to people either trying to get into the industry or people sort of earlier on in that journey where we can sort of learn, and hopefully you'll be able to do it a lot quicker than us than the 15 years it's taken us. And I guess we're just conscious that we're in a very hit-driven industry, and studios come and go. And if there's any way we can help that not be the case, that really motivates us. So let me share a bit of a story about Tonic Games and where we've come from. So I'm going to flash back to 2005 now. And so it's the year that the Xbox 360 launched. This is what mobile phones look like. So iPhones were not a thing. Sort of the mobile games industry that we now know was not anything that existed. And computer games, well, one game looked like this. This is actually Mediatonic's first ever game. Snowman Salvage. It was actually one of our founders' dissertations at university. So actually, Dave and Paul started the business in their final year of university. So that's where I want to start talking about really. So what I've done is actually I've divided up our history into kind of three different segments. And so the first one, I've actually called it Building the Basics, but I guess sort of the best way to sort of explain this stage, and I appreciate there's quite a few people in sort of that 0 to 5 people category. You may have come from sort of other studios in the past, and so you've got a feel of how to create games, but actually sort of taking that leap to starting your own companies, it's a pretty big jump. So it's no longer just about making a game or even making a game which is financially successful. It's actually about recruiting people, building out a team. And so there's a whole new load of considerations that suddenly come across that you have to deal with. And it probably is the hardest stage. Each day brings a new challenge. But it's also a really exciting time. There's a really great panel at the end of the day where they're talking about value. And so actually what they'll be doing is considering that in each of these different growth stages, what things you want to consider. So when is there value in bringing a marketing team or a finance team? So I'll let them go into much more detail. What I want to sort of, I guess, leverage on a bit sort of stronger is actually kind of all these things that you need to do, they need to be funded. And so I can't stress this enough. I've done it 3 circles because it's so important. But at this stage, cash is kind of so essential. And whether it's in sort of our industry or in other industries that I've worked with, it's predominantly cash that determines whether a business succeeds or fails. And so actually there may be no issues with the underlying game or the product. It may look great, but it will be the sort of cash side, which actually is where businesses struggle. So kind of this is so important in the early stages. And this is something that us as a business, we really focused on. And there's 3 things that we do and kind of what I've seen successful businesses do that I just want to touch upon. So first of all, and apologies, this is quite detailed, but it's so important that that's why I want to go into this level of detail. But something I've sort of always done where I've been is cash forecasting. And it doesn't matter if you're not great at Excel, but just kind of the core basics. And what we do is on a weekly basis, we produce a 13-week forward-looking cash forecast. And it's as simple as putting in which week you think cash is going to be coming in and which weeks you're going to be paying out kind of the material cash, so whether that's your salaries or your subcontracts or your rent. We also do something similar on a monthly basis, looking out for the next 18 months, but it's so important, and kind of where I've seen businesses fail is they haven't looked that far out. They've suddenly seen they have a big tax liability, which they can't get around, and that's kind of when it causes real problems. So I really strongly encourage doing that. Also, in terms of then just looking at your cash terms, so I guess it's worth sort of just explaining the way we funded the business when we first started, and it's a very common route, it's something that people refer to as bootstrapping. But this is by not obtaining necessarily external financing, but using your own savings or the profit you make within the business to fund your operations. And often there's not much surplus cash, which makes things quite tight. One way that cash does come in is actually if you're working with a publisher. But what's really important is to look at those terms with that publisher and look at what ways you can maximize it. And an example which I came across recently, which I've seen a few times, is actually from a production perspective, it makes a lot of sense to be producing a game with quarterly milestones. What that normally means then is actually you only get to invoice on a quarterly basis, so it takes 3 months to be paid. On top of that, some of the big publishers then say, well, it's going to take 60 days to pay you. So suddenly you've got 5 months you need to fund. With a team of 20 people, that's probably going to be over £500,000 that you need to fund. And it's kind of almost the right intention from a production perspective. You may choose to do that, but it can have really serious implications. So it's really worth just bearing that in mind. Again, typically these publishers, liquidity is not an issue for them, so you really can push them. So ask for upfront payments, look at any ways you can just to kind of model that out better. Last point, again, this feels pretty detailed, but it's such an easy win, is just thinking about the process when it comes to cash. Again, I've seen lots of times where this isn't done as quickly as it could be, but if you can invoice someone on the last day of the month, make sure you do that. Follow up 4 days later, make sure they've received the invoice, follow up again a week later, and make sure you can check when you're going to be paid. I've seen it many a time where people actually don't get around to invoicing until 3-4 weeks after the end of the month. They then don't actually check for another month if it's until it's long overdue whether they've received it, and suddenly that's an extra month or two of you not being paid. That can cost, again, for a 20-person business, that's about £100,000. So they're quite big numbers, and sort of, I guess, relatively easy wins that you can do to stay on top of this. There's one other thing I'll briefly touch upon, but the guys from Shipley coming up next would do much more justice explaining this because it's relatively complex. And the government actually gives some really great grants called video games tax credits, which can help you get quite a large proportion of what you spend back as a tax credit. So again, when you're just thinking about funding, that's definitely something worth looking into, but I'll let the guys explain that in much more detail. So that's a very quick run through the very first phase for us. And so I guess just reiterating the key points, this is a very hard phase. And so you guys that are kind of starting out your studios, you will be faced by challenges. It's kind of now is the time, just keep going and pushing on. Make sure you understand the drivers and sort of the risks attached to your cash. And so whether that's sort of where something can go wrong, if a game can get terminated, what would that mean? And then just make sure you forecast and manage. So you can look at any ways to maximize how you do things. So that was our first 5 years. That was predominantly how things worked. And so it's a really interesting time, but sort of that key focus around cash really helped us. We then got to the point in 2010 where actually we wanted to grow more quickly. We'd learned an awful lot over those 5 years on how to make games, but we were quite restrained by not having capital to do it. So sort of the second stage that we enter into is something called building for growth. So this is really looking about getting external financing into the business to help sort of accelerate how you do things. Again, we've got a couple of really great speakers or panels later today. So Matt from Sugar is going to be talking about this in a bit more details. And likewise, we've got 3 great speakers who are actually from investor side who will be talking about this. So I'll go relatively light on the details, but I just wanted to give a bit of an introduction to it and some context to what we did. So kind of quite crudely, there's 2 options. You can either look at debt or equity. So in terms of debt, that's looking at money. I guess the simplest form of that is actually getting a loan from a bank. It's quite hard to do. You're kind of in your early stages. The bank doesn't have a lot of security and what they can place that on. So it's often that actually people look at an equity route. And so in terms of equity, I guess your most common, easiest way to explain it is giving shares in your company to someone externally. And there's kind of a range of ways, and kind of depending on where you are on that journey, probably is where you kind of go down on this scale here. And so I mentioned bootstrapping is a very early stage, kind of working your way down, sort of very common. Sort of the next entrance route is angel investors or maybe the VCs, so venture capitalists. What Tonic Games did in 2010, we looked for angel investors, and then a couple of years later, we actually then brought on the VC firm. And this is again, it brings a sort of a whole new level of expectation in terms of that commercial understanding. So it's not just about cash anymore. You need to understand all the commercial drivers of your business, because those individuals, they're looking not only to invest in a game that you're producing, they're investing as you as people being able to run a business. So it's really important you can give them confidence you can do that. I spoke to some of our early investors, so we kind of have some real big hitters. So people like Ian Livingston, and Kelly Summer kind of were one of the early investors. And so Dave and Paul, they were in their mid-20s at the stage, and suddenly getting an absolute grilling from these seasoned professionals. But it's whilst that is tough, it's a real opportunity to learn from people like this. So it definitely brings advantages. I'll let the panels kind of talk a bit more detail about what they typically look for in these scenarios. The one example I'll share is at my previous company, when we were coming to look for, we're actually selling the business, but it's sort of a similar rule applies. We were about 80 people when we started the process. There was a 3,000 or 4,000 person business that was very interested in us, and they had a Silicon Valley private equity firm. It was quite easy to feel intimidated, and what we tried to do was try and make the playing field as level as possible. So we really pushed back on them, not just on the price they were offering, but also in terms of really getting them to articulate the value of them being part of our business, because actually we're really valuable. We also issued them a due diligence checklist to them before they'd issued it to us. So we wanted to see their accounts, their forecasts, their track record. And so it really kind of leveled out the relationship, and it was quite an interesting dynamic they'd never seen before, but it kind of, I guess, gave us quite a bit of, and they gave us respect for doing something like that. So it's the investors may not appreciate me saying that, but it's definitely worth challenging them. So that's kind of that stage. Again, relatively quick overview, but the sort of following talks will go into this in much more detail. But just to be aware, so that commercial complexity and expectations will increase. And this is not just about drivers of the business, it's actually just around the corporate function. So you're suddenly going to be having people sitting on your board who weren't previously. That will probably mean they will have certain control, which you won't have anymore. So there's a whole load of things that you really need to get your head around. But again, if you're using good advisors, they should be able to help you on the journey. One other point to mention is a deal. They are time consuming. So you're probably expecting something like 6 months of time you will be focused on this, and that could have a detrimental impact on the underlying parts of your business. So just don't overlook that. And then lastly, just don't be shy to challenge that investor with what they can do for you, and are they the right partner. So that was actually our first 11 years, very quickly in 10 minutes. And then this takes us to the next point. And so it was 2016, and things were going really well. We were up to 100 people. We were a free game studio, and so we kind of felt that we had a relatively well diversified portfolio. When disaster struck in December, no less, of that year, where not one but all 3 of our games were cancelled. So we were working with publishers, and they were all cancelled. So we suddenly had this huge weight bearing on us that there's 100 people that we definitely did not want to be making redundant just before Christmas. Fortunately, sort of the points I mentioned right at the start around cash is something that we'd always held very true to our values. And so it's probably one of our proudest achievements. We didn't make a single person redundant at that stage. And so we were able to fund it ourselves through cash until we found sort of alternative sources of income. What we also then decided at that point, which is something we've been building for the last 5 years, is actually building a business to last. And so that's kind of one of our really key values I mentioned at the start, but kind of trying to create something sustainable. And so we did a few things. So we looked to see how we could diversify our risks. So we actually created another studio called Fortitude in Guildford. We actually decided to create our own publishing business. And what we wanted to do was actually create a more developer-friendly publishing business, where actually, we're less aggressive in terms. We can use our experience both as a developer but also as a publisher to help them on their journey. And so again, what we do is we fund sort of a real mix of games, and anything from a relatively small sort of a couple of sort of 10, 20,000 investment up to sort of in the millions, and just whether it's sort of, it may be something that we want to explore, I'm more than happy to refer you to those guys. What we also try to do is actually just break down the relationship we have with our publishers, because actually that's sort of where we had a large amount of exposure. And to sort of perhaps explain the sort of the journey we went on this, it's worth talking about the value chain of almost the relationship we've had with publishers to that date. So very early on, sort of the first few years of the company, what I define as sort of making games. So we would work with a publisher, they would pay us a person month rate for the number of people we were providing, and we would deliver a game. The publisher wasn't really that reliant on us, I guess, so well, some of the advantages, we were getting a stable income to actually learn how to make games. So it's kind of, it was very, really useful in the early stages, and kind of I'd actually really strongly recommend it. As you're starting to build out a studio, you're effectively having someone else fund that learning. However, you don't own the game, you can't talk about it publicly, and you don't benefit from the sales of that game, and you're very much at sort of the risk that if a publisher chooses to terminate that game, you don't have a lot of rights. What we started to then do is actually what I call running games. So this is perhaps more around mobile games, where you're starting to support the live operations, but effectively you're really starting to understand what makes that game successful. You're creating content or features as the game is live to sort of actually improve the value of that game. The publisher becomes more reliant on you. You still get this stable income. You're probably likely to share in some of that upside, maybe not huge amounts, but you're actually kind of more closely aligned to what their motives are. You still don't own that game. You still can't talk about it publicly. You don't have that creative control that you'd hope. And there's still a risk of the game being terminated. However, you're starting to become more successful, which actually allows you to then sort of get into the next phase, which is conceiving ideas and conceiving games. And so you may have actually sort of been able to sort of have some money aside to start investing in a pitch team. So you can actually start going out to publishers and presenting your ideas. So you can conceive this idea, it's your own creative vision. You're likely to have a higher share in the royalties. You may well own the game depending on the dynamics of the relationship. You probably still can't 100% afford to finance that game. You probably need them as a marketing power. So you're still reliant on a publisher. But it kind of starts to get you into this different places, which where we started to edge towards. I just want to dissect across and just sort of think about kind of almost when working with that publisher from perhaps a more commercial or legal aspect next. And so sort of, again, I could talk for hours on this. I'll kind of try and condense it into a few minutes. The key point I'd say is you're probably going to have a lawyer go through a contract with you, and they'll put through a whole series of comments and red lines, which they recommend you push back on a publisher. Your role will really be to understand where your commercial risk and where the commercial value of a relationship with a publisher sits, and then pick your battles and really dig in on those. And again, sort of it depends where you are on that spectrum of making games versus conceiving ideas. So sort of, I guess in those early stages, so in our first sort of 5 years or so, we were very focused on what rate we would be paid by a publisher, what the payment terms are, kind of what would happen under a termination scenario. Whereas actually then if you get to conceiving ideas so much further down the line, it's looking about, well, what royalties can you get in terms of, do you have IP ownership? Do you have sequel rights? And so, kind of these are certain things that you need to consider as you get to that. But it really can help as you start getting to the conceiving ideas point of view, that you start having much more power in a relationship. Where this takes you after that is actually you then get to a point where you're generating profits that you can actually then fund your own marketing. You get to the next level, you then actually can start financing your own games. And actually ultimately what that gets you is a self-reliance point. So that's kind of very much the journey we're trying to get on now. And there's sort of a whole series of benefits which you can then do. And so that's almost a very simplified approach of where I was sort of this you can hopefully get to by taking these different steps. I'm conscious of time. I think we've still got about 5 minutes left. So that's kind of, I'd say I'm really keen to take questions. I genuinely am really passionate about this. So there's my email address there. So if anyone does have questions, I'm more than happy to grab a virtual coffee or just email back and forth on it. I'll be in the Hangouts link at lunchtime to discuss this. And Leon, how are we doing for time? Can we take a couple of questions?
Yeah, we've got enough time to take a few questions. I'll just run through. Well, there's a really quick one. So someone mentioned, what's the name of the Tonics publishing company? You mentioned that, but they don't know what the name is.
Yeah, it's called the Irregular Corp or TIC. And again, if people want to message me, I can put you in touch with the best person who can give you some much better detail than I can on that.
Okay, cool. And then another one from Vince. So, Do worries about funding change the games you've made? What compromises to your early inspirations and any limitations due to your publisher's perception of you?
That's a very good question, and I guess it's kind of there's many different ways to tackle that. And I guess perhaps jumping back to sort of that value chain there, and I guess very sort of the very early stages where you have less influence on the relationship, that definitely influences because you're actually much more closely following the sort of their creative vision rather than you have. And it kind of, again, it varies by publisher. As you work your way up, that you have a much greater say over that kind of, so you have that much more freedom. And so we've kind of, I guess, had different scenarios and examples of where kind of you're impacted from that perspective. But the higher you climb up there, the much more the control you have over that is.
Okay. And then we've got another question from David. How did you decide on who to approach to help raise finance?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So again, it slightly depends where you are on that journey. So I didn't touch upon it that much either, but we also raised private equity funding last year. So you kind of got different elements of your journey in terms of, I guess, looking at sort of how much investment you're looking for. So it's an initial stage when we're looking in 2010, we knew we're quite early stages and we were looking at that angel investor perspective. So kind of that's why we're looking at that bracket. It's probably harder to actually obtain private equity funding in those early stages as well when you're 20, 25 people. So whereas later in the journey last year when we were up to about 150 people, it makes much more sense. You're looking for a more sizable investment, the business is worth more. So that's when you start leaning towards those investors. Specifically then who you look at, again, what we've done is, well, I guess with the private equity funding, it's much more a competitive process where you actually then can issue certain information about the company and get people to submit offers and kind of give that early indication of what they're looking at. And then you start to get to know the partner. With the sort of angel investors, it's probably less formal, but it's a similar approach of actually looking out to people is then really trying to understand of what value they can offer to you. And again, sort of, you're going to be working with these guys in a partnership. So actually looking at the individuals, so kind of how do you work with them? Can you see day to day, looking quite a lot at their attitude as well. So we're really lucky at the moment that we've got a great partner in Sonova. And so actually sort of, making sure that they're going to be aligned to our longer term view and not making short term decisions based on stuff. Also kind of giving us a degree of flexibility to run our business because we know how to. But also knowing that they've got experience to draw on, that actually there's certain times that they will come in with relevant challenge.
Okay, cool. And then we have another question from Andrew Smith, which is the time that you had 3 projects cancelled on you. Andrew said that he would cry about that, but he would love to have some insight into how you were able to approach solving that and how you make the team and people get through that quite safely.
Yeah, no, a great question. And there definitely was tears and panic as well, because it's a very big thing to deal with. It's sort of, again, you sort of almost get to this kind of degree of confidence at 11 years in that you're probably not that exposed. So to suddenly have this, it is rather daunting. And so I guess there's a couple of aspects to it. Again, it's kind of, we've been really keen to try and communicate with the team as much as possible. Again, it's difficult. You don't want to panic people. And so almost without being able to give full context, there's certain things which are harder to do, but where possible, we're actually trying to make people aware of what's happening in the business, but almost where we have a plan to deal with it. So that I think that's really important to make, and again, sort of more confidence we can give people that there aren't redundancies and things like that, that really starts to help. It's then sort of really trying to break it down. So it's kind of sort of mentioned, so there's various different ways, but it's trying to sort of dig through, well, where's the issue with this? How have we been so exposed to this? And so a lot of that was around the relationship with those publishers. So almost what ways can you sort of look to reduce that? And so again, diversifying the sort of the business that we have is sort of a key factor to it. So looking at, okay, if we've in the past we've been reliant on 3 very big companies that actually then can, they may have sort of aspects outside of their control where it's a company-wide decision where they have to cancel some games. How do we reduce that? So whether that's actually looking at different partners who are going to be less inclined to be making those decisions, or looking at sort of spreading that risk across a wider group of companies. So again, with the irregular corp, you're suddenly creating a new business where actually then they're investing in tens of games themselves, which actually then have a much less risk, as well as having Tonic working on sort of one type of game, and then having Fortitude, which actually has a different set of values. So you start sort of spreading that across. Again, it's quite nice now having the luxury of almost looking back on that. At the time, you're going through that journey and you're really trying to figure things out. And again, you probably have to make some decisions in the moment which perhaps aren't best for the long term. But in terms of, we knew that we needed to get some new games in, so you're starting to look at other games you can work on and probably having to react quite quickly, which may then impact you. If you sign up a game, you've got then 2 years of kind of working on that game. So those short-term decisions can have a long-term impact. And kind of in an ideal world, you look at those very balanced and long-term view, and that's not always possible. So you kind of almost just have to work with the information you've got at that time.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, and there's a few other questions in the chat, but I'm just conscious